Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Alice Krozer. I'm your host on the Inequalities channel for Futures Frame TV. Today, I'm here with Patrick Inglis. Patrick is a researcher and teaches sociology at Grinnell College in the US. He works on inequality and different angles of it, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about what he's doing right now. Patrick, thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Patrick, you wrote a book recently called Narrow Fairways that talks about elites and privilege in India. Could you tell me a little bit more about what the book is about?
Yeah, so the book came out last summer. It was a 10-year ethnography that I conducted at these 3 private golf clubs in Bangalore, India, which is in the south of India. And over these 10 years, I got to know both the members of these golf clubs, and the poor lower caste golf caddies, who carry the golf sets or the golf bags of these members as they play rounds of golf. They're 5-6 hours at a time. And so over time, as I got to know the caddies and then got to know the members, I was able to sort of get to know more about their interactions. And a lot of the work on inequality, and particularly poverty, tends to study down or it studies up. And so what I guess my sort of novel contribution to the field, if there is one, is that I tried to study across this social economic chasm or divide, if you will. There's many lessons I took from it, but that's basically what I did. What I learned and what I describe in the book is that as tough as it is to be poor and lower caste in India, to have these kinds of connections or the proximity to the rich. And there's a kind of ideal case or ideal type situation for the poor lower caste golf caddies, because they, as I described in the book, every day they're working at the side of very, very wealthy, powerful people, typically men in these private golf course settings. As a result of globalization, economic liberalization, and the underfunding and disinvestment in healthcare, education, and jobs programs, these jobs at the side, literally right at the side, sometimes at the feet of these wealthy people in India, becomes a means by which to survive. And some of the caddies do manage to come up, and there's instances of social mobility. Although in a lot of the cases that I studied, caddies did not have much of an opportunity to really elevate much beyond their sort of meager existence in terms of the cash in hand that they would earn at the end of the day. That basically was the study.
Do you think this non-mobility, this non-possibility of moving from poverty to a position of wealth that you studied in your context, is that representative for society at large?
That's a really good question. I'm an ethnographer. My own sense was that although these are private golf courses, and there's only a few hundred golf clubs in all of India, and this is a giant country. I mean, there's something like 17,000 golf clubs in the United States by comparison, right? So the golf caddies themselves have a very sort of unique labor, skill set. But I think that how they relate to the wealthy, to the rich on these golf courses is representative, right? So it could be the auto rickshaw driver. It could be, obviously domestic servants, domestic work, your cooks, your drivers, gardeners. There's a whole host of jobs in India that are performed by the poor, by the lower classes and the lower castes in service to elites. I mean, there's something like, and it's debatable, but there's 80 to 90% of the entire labor force is informal in India. And it's hard to get it right down to the number, like what percentage of those jobs would be represented by the kind of work that the caddies do. Not specifically caddy work, but that sort of, servant client kind of, dynamic relationship. But to your question, is it representative? Not when you think about the labor skill set, but it's representative, I would say, in terms of how the poor and the rich relate to one another, certainly. And the degree to which the poor and the lower classes and the working classes come to depend on these servile deferential ties with the rich. It really comes down to sustenance and survival, right? I was motivated originally to do this research. This was my PhD research back when I started it in 2007, 2008. There was so much in the literature on globalization talking about how there was this increasing inequality. And as a result of the increasing inequality, you saw this further and further social and physical separation of the rich and poor. And it became interesting to me to study these points of contact between the rich and poor. And at the time, and I'm not sure much has changed, even though we're in 2020, but there's not a lot on that takes into account how the rich and poor are actually drawn together as a result of economic liberalization and globalization and the underfunding and investment and the de-investment in education, healthcare, et cetera. There's not much to account for how the rich and poor are brought together. We sort of have assumed that they're being pulled apart. And I'm in this book, in this particular book, I'm writing about how they're being brought together.
You did change continents in the meantime after this project finished. You're still working on some issues in India, but now you're also working on a project in Mexico where you study the elites in Mexico. Is there a point of comparison? Do you find a similar context, although you're not in the same branch, let's say, not studying golf, but how do you think these places compare?
So India begins its process of economic liberalization really in earnest in 1991, although there have been efforts to open the economy already in the 1980s. And something similar happens as well in Latin America, and particularly in Mexico, where this new research project is situated. But there's also a different degree of difficulty I'm finding in the study of Mexico. Part of it's methodological. Like I was very focused on the micro order interactions between the wealthy and the poor in the space of these private golf courses. I'm trying to pose and answer larger macro order questions about the organization of the economy, the role that elites play, right? Not just in terms of their interactions with the poor and the working classes around them, but among themselves in setting up and organizing a society that benefits them. I think Mexico is a perfect sort of test case of the larger phenomenon. I mentioned this degree of difficulty. One is the sort of to move from the micro to the macro is its own sort of challenge. There's the language, Spanish, picking up Spanish, learning Spanish, which is not as easy as everybody says it is. And getting to know the culture of the elite. One of the benefits or positives, I suppose, is that Mexico, in comparison to India, is a much smaller country, and its elite, at least so far, appears to be much smaller, just in terms of its population, and its ties much denser. Like I'm sure in the individual states in India, you would find something similar, let's say. But this question of access, as you well know, is front and center for me, along with the other questions. And there's so much more to learn. I mean, it took me 10 years to write this first book, and it might take another 10 years to write the next book.
Okay, now so you have still like 9 years ahead of you with this project on that count. Yeah. But do you think this is the direction that you'll work in beyond this project? Is this what you're mainly interested in? Or do you think there are other aspects of inequality that would be interesting to research for you?
Well, and just to come back for a second to the case of Mexico, I mean, these are big questions and almost so ambitious as to be very naive. Who rules Mexico and how do they do it? These are like massive questions, right? And you could ask that about any country, I suppose. I mean, I'm thinking, C. Wright Mills in the United States talking about the power elite in the 1950s and 60s. And there's others that, of course, have followed in that vein. I guess another question and area of interest for me, too, is this 40-year window of economic liberalization, a period that we tend to refer to as neoliberalism, and the late 1970s, early 1980s until now, right, where markets have come to reign supreme, right, that we bow to markets to tell us how to live our lives, and for politicians and people in finance, how to organize the society. I'm wondering how Mexico fits into that history. Typically, when we write and think and talk about neoliberalism, we're talking about Margaret Thatcher in the UK in the 1980s, and we're thinking of Reagan in the United States. But to what degree or how did Mexico play a role in that larger class project that became neoliberalism? And that has produced the kinds of inequalities that we see now, globally, not only in the US, but everywhere, and particularly in Mexico. Again, very, very big questions, and there's a lot to learn. But to the question, like, is this an area of interest or focus for me? Yeah, I think so. I have a genuine curiosity about how our world is organized. How did we get here? How did we come to think that what we think is normal or taken for granted has become that way, right?
Where does this interest come from? Do you know, or what originated it?
That's a good question. I grew up in Vancouver, Canada, although I wouldn't say that everybody who grows up in Canada has these specific interests. I was a high school English teacher in a public school in Vancouver for a few years before I moved to New York City, where I worked on my PhD. And I think being attentive to the inequalities within my own classroom, there were, kids from different backgrounds. It was a predominantly working class, lower middle class neighborhood in which I worked. And then to come to the United States, and then my first year living in New York City, I lived up in Harlem. And just to be viewing and observing and interacting with people of different class and racial backgrounds, to be exposed to different inequalities. And also realizing, and I was 27, 28 at the time, that I had never really engaged these questions, right? So personally, I sort of set out to pose these questions. I don't know if I have all the answers. I certainly don't have all the answers, but for me, it's about curiosity and about these questions, about why is the world the way it is? And obviously very topical now, the topic of race in the United States of America, right? Like, as a white middle-class man living in the United States, I live in Des Moines, Iowa. How is it and why is it that the spaces that I tend to occupy, I'm talking about the social spaces, are predominantly white, right? It's Iowa, it's the Midwest. That's one way of explaining it. But Des Moines, like any city in the United States, is highly segregated. There are Black people living in Des Moines and across the Midwest. That's something that's just more recently on my mind, of course, and I think it's on the mind of a lot of people living in the United States right now. So to answer your question, it comes from this sense of curiosity about why things are the way they are, and the realization that they don't have to be the way they are. Right. So when we talk about inequality, we can talk about natural inequalities, and we can talk about social, political, economic inequalities, and that's that. Things don't have to be this way.
And that leads us to our probably last question, but very important question. What could we do about this situation?
I think what we could do and can do and should do, these are all related, of course. I think there seems to be some kind of emerging consensus about what needs to happen, right? It's about the distribution of wealth, right? In the United States, for instance, wages have more or less been stagnant. In this 40-year period that I talked about earlier, had been more or less stagnant, right? Labor in the United States has been weakened and diminished considerably, right? So the ability of labor to people sort of to band together and to press employers and politicians to raise wages, to improve working conditions, to raise taxes on the rich. The possibility of that kind of solidarity has been diminished. But to draw out sort of two things here. One is this distribution of a more fair and just distribution of wealth, right? And the recognition that the wealth is being created by labor. And then I think, how do you get there is having some kind of collective labor movement and organization, right? Like these are related. And we've had these debates with one another. To what extent will the elite, the so-called political, financial, economic elite of our societies, globally as well as within the countries where we live and where we do research, to what degree will these elites change tax policy, fiscal policy, let's say, raise wages, improve working conditions, in the absence of organized movements from below? I'm a little bit more pessimistic on that point compared to you, I think. Would you agree?
Probably, yes.
Probably. But the other piece here is how do we organize to pressure those kind of changes that we need, right? That's where we're stuck. I have a sense, I think, as you, of what needs to happen. How do we get there? Short of mass revolution, right? This is, I think, the challenge of the 21st century. I would also say that natural, although not entirely natural, but climate change there are these ways that the earth quite literally can move and therefore determine or influence how we reorganize society, right? So I think about mass global labor movements combined with the climate crisis that we're enduring. And then there's this puzzle of how to reach out and to connect and pressure the elite who are concentrating ever more stores of wealth and resources for themselves. How to resolve it, I don't know. I know what needs to be done. I think a lot of people, though, in the social sciences particularly, and not just in academia, know what needs to be done. We're all stuck at how to get it to happen.
Patrick, thanks so much for sharing these very interesting insights with us. Probably we shouldn't wait for mass revolution or climate catastrophe, but continue thinking about these issues for ourselves. Amongst academia, certainly that's a responsibility. For us, people working on elite research and on inequality research, we're trying to figure out these very important questions that Patrick posed. If you haven't read his book and you're interested in the subject, I recommend Narrow Fairways. And we hope that we'll speak to you again soon when you have, in a couple of years, an output for your new project.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for watching. And if you are interested in this topic, we hope that you join us again next time at Futures Frame TV. I'm Krozer, your host on the Inequalities channel. Have a good afternoon. Goodbye.